Alright, continuing on with layers, we have just covered creating a layer and looking at things in the composition window as far as all the settings go along the bottom. Now we're moving on to the timeline window and see what the layer has for us to offer here. In the timeline window, you'll see that you have, or we're looking at a single layer here. Eventually you'll have a project that has, 40, 100, well, however many layers you might actually be managing in your project. It's not uncommon to have over 50. But here we have just one, and it's the yellow solid that I made. And it has there are several ways that you can select a solid, and the first way is just by clicking on its name in the timeline window, and you'll see that the result is that it becomes highlighted here. The color of the layer in the timeline actually gets sort of lightened, I suppose. It also has some sort of texture. Looks like ground beef. And then visually up in the composition window, it's selected. It has handles along the corners, sides, top and bottom, and it has a center mark, which is your anchor point. So to select a layer, you can click on it in the timeline, or you can click on it in the composition window. And that's something you should just get used to doing, clicking on it, clicking off of it. Clicking off of it just deselects it. If you have any empty space in your timeline, that's very easy to do, is to just click there and deselect it. However, there may be a time when you've got a whole timeline full of them, and it's hard for you to find empty space. So you can click off of a layer in the timeline by clicking in an empty space to the left of the name of that solid. Let's undo all those. Okay. Or you can click in an empty space up in your composition window. So here it's selected. I'm just moving off to where there's nothing, and I'll click and it's deselected. That also gets a little crazy if you've got an entire composition that's populated with different layers, and some of them cover the entire screen, so it may be hard to find a place in which you can click somewhere off of a layer. In that case, you can just use your edit deselect all button, which is Command Shift A. It's definitely a handy one to get used to. Alright, so my timeline is riddled with many little buttons again, and we'll go through all of these things from left to right. So this layer has a visibility switch, which is the eyeball. And usually it's on the very left side of your timeline, but I've seen somehow people end up rearranging these things and they're on the right or whatever. But basically just look for the eyeball. The eyeball is the visibility of a layer. You can turn it on and off, just like you could in Photoshop or Illustrator. So when a layer has visibility turned off, it will not be a player in your project. So you can have layers in your timeline, in your comp, they're just turned off. And when you render your movie, they just won't be part of your movie. So in order for a layer to be a player in your movie, to actually be rendered, it needs to be visibly enabled through your little visibility switch here. You have a column or a switch for audio, but since there's no audio that this layer is producing, then there's no audio switch for me. But if this were a QuickTime movie that I brought in and it had audio, I would have the ability to turn on or off the audio for that layer. The next column over is your solo column, and if if I had several other layers on my composition and I wanted to just focus on one of them, I can click on the solo button, and that turns the visibility of all the other layers off and allows me to just focus on the one layer. So this really ends up being helpful, especially when you have just a ton of stuff everywhere and you're having a hard time either selecting something just because there's so many other things that are competing with space, or layers on top of it or something like that. Solo is helpful that way. It's also just nice for you to focus on one thing sometimes. And you can solo as many layers as you want. So now I'm soloing 2 layers, now I'm soloing 3. But if I solo all of them, what's the point? May as well just have solo turned off on all of them, and my visibility will be enabled for all 4 layers. I will get rid of you. Okay. And then you have a lock, which will lock your layer. You can't click on it. You can't select it. You can't move it. You can't do anything. If you try to, it gives you a little flash warning that says, sorry, Charlie, it's locked. So then you just have to remember, oh yeah, right, I have to go unlock it. I should just move this back to the center-ish. Ooh, good time for me to use my title safe, because now I know where my center is for this thing. I can just go boop and just put it in the center, and I'm good. Okay, this little triangle is a twirly that opens up any of the attributes that your solid has. So every solid that you work with has transform properties. So that's something you could expect all the time. Whether or not you've applied an effect to a layer, you would see those listed here as well, or if you applied layer styles, masks and so on, you're going to see that listed underneath this twirly. We'll come back to that when we get into animating. Right now I'm just going to breeze past it. This layer is currently given the label of being a solid layer, which has the red property, but I could change it if I wanted to. I could click on that thing and choose purple or whatever. It's a way for you to possibly keep all like elements in a composition kind of grouped together or color coded so that you can identify them and differentiate them between each other. This 1 is just telling me the layer number of the stacking order. So this is the topmost layer. It's layer 1. If I had 4 layers, they're listed as layer 1, 2, 3, and 4, but they also have their own names as well. So then you have your solid name and a little bit of information here. This is the color. Whoops, I just double clicked on it by accident. We'll get into that later too. Bye-bye. This gives you the name of your solid. Then we come here to our shy button, which if you enable shy on a layer, here, let's do this. Let me undo that and give myself some more solids. If I were to click on the shy button for this layer 1, nothing really happens. I see that the little guy with his nose hanging over the wall is now hiding behind the wall. That's what that icon is, if you can believe it. I mean, at least that's what I've interpreted it to be. I'd love it if it wasn't, and this whole time I thought it looked like a guy with his nose hanging over the wall. Anyways, he's hiding behind the wall now, but nothing has changed until, oh, it's totally a guy hanging. Yeah, of course. All I have to do is go look at this button. Here's the button for shying the layers that have shying enabled. So I have one layer that has shying enabled. If I click on this button here, the little guy with his nose hanging over the wall, doop, that layer is absent now from the list of layers in my timeline. However, it's still visible. All it's doing is allowing me to get some layers out of the way in my timeline. Maybe they're layers that I've already animated and I've got everything set up. I'm happy with how they are, but I've got like 40 some layers and I just want to get rid of, basically trim the fat visibly in my timeline. So I could shy all the layers that I'm pretty satisfied with, or maybe layers that I'll come back to later, and then click on the shy button, and they're just going to go away and not be visible in the timeline. they are visible in the comp. They're still going to be performing, you know, whatever animations you've given them, whatever. Um, but it's just a way for you to tidy that up. So when that button is darkened, that means any layers that have shy enabled will just kind of disappear in the timeline, and when it's turned off, then they're all going to be there. Now let's go back and turn that guy off. Get rid of my solids. Okay, then next to that we have continual rasterization. I'm not going to talk about that right now. You'll get that later. We have whether or not our layer is going to be displayed in fine quality or draft quality. The difference here on this switch is a pixely slope versus a nice clean slope. So if it's like this, that means draft quality and it won't look as good. And if it's like this, it's at fine quality, it'll look better. The reason you would use this is if you're just trying to increase the performance factor in After Effects, make it run better while you work. But generally you can achieve all of that by going through your resolution and just lowering that stuff. Frame blending and effects, we're not going to skip right now. Motion blur, adjustment layers in 3D we're not going to get into. Parenting we're not going to get into. I'm just going to let you know that those are there. And then we have the layer itself, and the layer exists for the entire duration of your composition. My composition was set for 10 seconds. That means that this solid that I created through the layer menu is also going to be 10 seconds long. And that was all something that's set up in the preferences. We saw this under importing, I think, where footage is going to be the length of the composition, as opposed to like 2 frames or a second long or whatever it could be that you have that set to in your preferences. All right, so then we're going to move down to, oh well, I did skip this, time code. Time code, this is the same thing as a time code in your composition window. I just clicked on it, darn it. Tells you where you're at, what your current time is, and that's all defined by this little guy, which is your playhead. Actually, are they calling it something else? Current time indicator. It's our CTI. So wherever you have your CTI, I'm going to call it a playhead. That's where you're at in time. So normally you'd see things moving as you dragged this little playhead around. It's called scrubbing, moving this thing back and forth through time. But basically, wherever that is, this little time bar here, it's going to let you know where you're at in your time code. So I'm at 21 frames. So I'm only 9 frames away from a full second. This little hand that you see popping up over the timeline is a little indicator which maybe you're getting used to seeing from like Photoshop and stuff, but it allows you, this means, hey, you could grab this value and scrub it left or right, and that's going to adjust the location of current time. So if I were to start dragging this left or right, you see that I'm increasing or decreasing time, and that also is having an impact on my playhead, which is moving forward or back in time. You can also just click on this thing and get your timeline, or sorry, your time code to highlight and then enter some value. So if I wanted to go to 2.5 seconds, I would type in 2:15, 15 or 30 frames per second. That means 15 frames is half a second. So this is going to be 2 seconds and 15 frames. As soon as I hit enter, it takes me right to 2.5 seconds in the timeline. You can also do things like plus. So I could say, okay, the current time where I'm at, let's go +8. And now I've advanced 8 frames forward. I'm at 2 seconds and 23 frames. That comes in handy when you're trying to do like incremental movements and animations. So like if you wanted something to happen every 3 frames, it's a lot easier for you to just say, go 3 frames forward, go 3 frames forward, instead of having to go, what's 23 plus 3? That's 26. Then what's plus 3 again is, I mean, it's a terrible example. Everyone should be able to add 3 to a number. But maybe it's something like 17 frames, and that gets a little crazy, especially when you're working in a time code time base of 30 frames per second. So come on. we can do that. Now, if you're going to subtract time, this gets pretty silly. You have to say plus minus 13 frames or whatever it is. Then that will go back 13 frames, because if I say let's go to minus, oh, I hope they didn't fix this, minus 13, yeah, they did. I'm now in a time that does not exist in my composition. Why would they let me go there? God, I don't know. But I'm in BC land here, so there's nothing visibly acknowledged on my composition window. I don't even see my playhead anymore, so you have to be careful with the adding of stuff. Let's go back to 2 seconds and do that again. It's plus minus 15 frames. There we go. Let's just go back to 0. Frame 0. Okay. You can search for anything inside your timeline window just by going here and searching for a certain effect or a certain name of a layer, and I'll find it. Okay, what else? Down at the bottom here, the bottom of the window, you have expand or collapse the layer switches, columns or panes they call them. And basically you can see that as I expand or collapse, this group of switches is either presenting itself or going away. These are called your switches. There's also something called transfer controls, and I can open those up or hide them as well, and that just gives me several more columns that I have access to. It's different information. But as you start to, put all this stuff in there, you're losing more and more real estate for your timeline. Your timeline is where you're really doing all the work, so it's very important that you have as much of that as you can, which is why they gave us this feature at the very bottom of that column. I'm just back to switches now, and at the bottom here I have toggle switches and modes, and that just switches out between the two. So I've got my switches, and then I've got my modes, or the transfer controls they call them. They should keep these things named the same, otherwise they're going to confuse all of us. The very last button here next to the first two we talked about is expand or collapse the in and out duration stretch panes, which just gives you the duration of your layers, its in value, its out value, the duration, and the stretch. And that's something that we'll talk about later, but you rarely ever need those things there. So that's what that is. Underneath the timeline itself, you have this slider that is your zoom level in time. So there's little mountains and big mountains, so you can do it through increments. You can zoom in by clicking on big mountain, or zoom out by clicking on the little mountain. And that just is allowing you to go into time at a much more critical view, basically. It's not having any effect on your work or your animation. It's not slowing things down. It's just allowing you to get in nitpicky with your frame. So like here I'm zoomed in all the way, and I see that I have every frame almost. Here we go. Here's every frame. Frame 0, frame 1, frame 2, and so on, all the way, down to the end of time. And as you zoom in, you have much more scrolling that you can do. So you can scroll all throughout this thing. And, there is a time when you're going to be zoomed in to do specific quick moves or whatever, but usually you'll be zoomed out or maybe just zoomed in a little bit. The slider you can also just grab and drag and zoom however you see fit. Okay, that's all I'm going to cover in the timeline for this part. We'll move on to animation properties next.